Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this Gaming.com video, we're going to be discussing and analysing tech news which, as usual, popped up over the past 24 or so hours. We're going to start things out with yet another SKU in the GTX 1060 lineup. Yup, another GTX 1060 card. So, for those unfamiliar, so far the GTX 1060 lineup is absolutely gargantuan. You have the GTX 1060 6GB card, the 6GB 9GBps card, a 3GB card, and so on and so on. But there is another GPU in town, supposedly, and this one's going to be launched at the very least from Gigabyte, but it's very different from the cards I just mentioned. For a start, it uses a different core. It will be using the GP104. Furthermore, as an extension to that, it will also be utilizing GDDR5X memory, albeit on a 192-bit bus. So at least in theory, this will have 6GB of memory and a number of CUDA cores cut. So it will have fewer CUDA cores than a GTX 1080 or 1070, but more, in theory, than a vanilla GTX 1060. So in theory at least, this will put out a level of performance between the two. It will also mean though that we have yet another card in an already packed Pascal lineup. Now why is this? Well, there's several possibilities. The first is that it will be aimed at the internet cafes in China. So these could be GP104 cores that quite simply did not make the cut for one of the other higher end SKUs in the Pascal lineup. Therefore, rather than just chucking them away, what they can do is they can use them in these 1060s, which I don't have a problem with. It just means that the GTX 1060 gets yet another card. But don't forget, from what we can gather anyway, NVIDIA will not be releasing the 2060, whether that's going to be an RTX 2060, a GTX 1060, or whether it's going to be an entirely different naming convention until some point next year. So what that means is that NVIDIA need to get rid of the cores it currently has available and just, well, sell them to us. It's not necessarily a problem. It will just be interesting to see whether people buy this or not. But still, given that NVIDIA are also going to be competing still with AMD in this segment. In fact, we're going to get into some RX 590 news. There's been yet further updates to that story in just a moment. It does make sense because the 1060 and 580 do kind of trade blows. So for NVIDIA to release this either officially, as in like an entire new product, or whether they just give permission for AIBs like Gigabyte or whomever to release this on their own, it does kind of make sense because it does help thwart AMD in that particular market. So then, what about this RX 590? A few days ago, we did cover the news that there was an entry in the 3D Mark database. And yep, it did appear that there was a new card in the Polaris lineup. It could be known as the 590, and it does score higher than the 580. So yes, the refresh rumours for Polaris do appear to be real. But there is yet more information that has now popped up from other sources. Videocards.com and a couple of other websites claim to be speaking to various AIBs, and they are confirming some of these rumours. According to one source, Asus are bringing the ROG Strix brand back for the Radeon RX series, and the 590 will feature 8GB of memory, and it will actually have its own unique product code, as you would expect, and it will be a refresh of Polaris, so it will be utilising the 12nm process. So this means it's got memory running at 2000 MHz or 8GBps if you prefer. Now, one area we can definitely see an improvement are clock speeds. The core, for example, has been raised from the 1350-ish MHz that we see for the 580 up to, at least according to the 3D Mark entry we're seeing here, 1545 MHz, so roughly around 180 to 200 MHz. Of course, that does depend upon the AIB and whether it's factory overclocked and that type of thing. So it's not really a massive increase in performance or anything, but it does depend what AMD do. If they slot it into the current 580 lineup, in terms of price, but it does depend heavily what AMD do. If they discontinue the RX 580 or they bring down the price of the 580 and 570 and plonk in the 590 in the price slot that we currently have for the 580, it does make sense. And then of course they can basically sell off the 580s and so on, and it does help tide things over for AMD. I think given how close we are to Christmas, we're not going to see a new GPU, certainly not with more compute units from AMD. I think Vega and Polaris refresh is about what we've got. It makes sense though. I mean, if AMD can target the 160, 170 US dollar mark, roughly, give or take a few cents here or there, I think that would really make a lot of sales over Christmas, because 1080p, 1440p are still very popular with gamers. There's a reason that the 1060 is so popular, and Nvidia have released so many different variants of it. I actually have an RX 480 here, and until recently it was actually inside one of my main systems. In fact, I still use it occasionally because it's still a really nice card, and for 1080p, 1440p, it does a pretty admirable job. And clearly, the 480 is not as fast as the 580, and by extension, the 590 will be a lot faster still. These things, they make sense. And I think AMD might be on the right track here, at least in the short term. We'll have to wait in the future to see what Navi brings, and it's quite exciting, the prospect of a 7nm GPU from AMD, if they can get the pricing right. Let's say it's around the 2080 performance level, but they can release it a couple $100 cheaper. It might really put a lot of pressure on Nvidia. But of course, all of this stuff is just theoretical. And once again, until we actually see what AMD have, perhaps at CES, hopefully early next year, in other words, well, we can only just wait and see. But this is good news for those who don't want to plonk down the cash on a 2070 or higher, or perhaps they don't want to go the used market where you can get some really good bargains right now from eBay. So that's just something to bear in mind. And now we're going to move over to the Intel 9th generation of processors, because review embargoes have lifted. So now we get an understanding of how these processors compete. And now we're going to look through some results of the 9th generation processors from Intel. Now that the NDAs and the review embargoes have lifted, we can start looking at the performance of these processors and analyze whether it's worth you upgrading from your 8th generation processors, or whether you should go with like a Ryzen CPU and so on. I'm actually swamped right now with other reviews. You can see there's like a box there from MSI. There's like a couple more boxes and some other bits and pieces I have to go through. So I haven't even wanted to start the 9th generation reviews, because I just have been in Seattle. I literally only got back a couple of days ago. So quite frankly, I just would not have had time to do a decent job. So they are in the pipeline from us, but a number of people have asked my opinion on whether it's worth upgrading and the value proposition here, so I figured I'd throw in my couple of cents, and you can make of it as you will. I'm going to be looking at this primarily from the perspective of value. If you want my opinion on whether they're the best gaming processor, yes. You can just stop watching the video now. They are the best gaming processor, but they also are more expensive. Whether you're looking at the i9-9900K and other SKUs, they are more expensive than what AMD's offerings are. Now, whether you have the budget for that or not, and we'll get more into the value in just a moment as an in-depth analysis of that, or whether you are more like, well, I've only got the X amount of cash, should I spend that on this processor? That, of course, is down to you and your wallet, but we'll go through some results and then you can make your decision. We're going to start things out with the results of the encryption, VeraCrypt AES 1GB buffer. The 8700K scores 10,500 megabytes per second. The 2700X scores 12,100 megabytes per second. And the 9900K achieves it in 14,500 megabytes per second. With the BMW test in Blender, that's BMW 2.7, the 9900K achieves it in 250 seconds, the 2700X 264 seconds, the 8700K 311 seconds, Cinebench R15, the 2700X scores 1,820 points, the 9900K scores 1,914 points, so a 100-point difference there, and the 8700K scores 1,432 points. In terms of relative game performance, the 9900K is at 100%, the 8700K is 98.1%, so just a couple of percent slower. This is at 1080p relative game performance, and the 2700X is around 8% slower. Of course, that is using a high-end GPU. With Ashes of the Singularity on a GTX 1060 with AnandTech, the 9900K is 103 frames a second, the 8700K is essentially at 100 frames a second, and finally the Ryzen 7 2700X scores around 70 frames a second. Far Cry 5, average frames per second, with a 1080 GTX 1080 at 1080p, normal settings, 138 frames a second with the 9900K, 133 frames a second with the 9700K, the 8700K hits 127 frames a second, and the 2700X meanwhile still scores a pretty impressive 114 frames a second. Now here's the thing, if you were to look at the pricing of the 9900K, it is currently retailing at just a shade under $500 US. And this is, to me, the sticky situation. This thing requires a pretty beefy cooler if you want to overclock. And you can argue the same about Ryzen as well, but certainly you can drop at least $100 US, preferably a little more, on the cooler to really push the 9900K. You also, of course, need the correct motherboard as well, ideally a Z390, and those boards are not cheap. Also looking, you know, at the low $200 US mark for a really good board. What does that mean? Well, it basically means it's going to eat up a lot of your budget. Just the CPU and motherboard alone are going to be around $700 US, plus the cooler is another, let's say, $100 US. So yeah, you are looking at the best part of $1,000 US right there on just the CPU, motherboard, and cooler. The 9900K is essentially $500 US. Then a decent motherboard is going to run you about $200 US, and then ideally you're going to spend at least another $100 to $200 US on a cooler, particularly if you want to start really cranking up the clock speed. So in theory at least, you're spending $800, $900 US on just the motherboard, the cooler, and the processor. Now that is fine if you have that amount of cash. Personally though, if gaming is your main priority, I would rather you spend that money on a GPU or something else if you've got a limited budget. If you've not, and money's no object, and you want the best gaming processor, by all means, go out and buy a 9900K. If, on the other hand, you have a more limited budget, I think the 9700K or a Ryzen 7 2700X just makes more sense. For example, the 2700X you can get for under $300 now that AMD have just plopped in those price cuts. A B450 motherboard, which of course does allow you to overclock, well, it depends on the board type and what features, but certainly you can get one for under $100 US for a B450, and that honestly, you can actually get them much cheaper. You can get them for around $80 US, which is pretty darn good. So $380 US plus the cooler, let's say you get a decent AIO, which is around 80 to 100. That right there saves you quite a bit of cash. Does that mean that I'm saying that the 9900K is a bad processor? No. I'm simply saying that if you are on a budget and therefore you're going to really want to put as much money into your GPU as possible, then I would advise the 9900K is technically, yes, the ultimate gaming CPU, for now at least, but I think you'd be better served to put that money into other aspects of your rig. And as we've seen consistently now, the GPU is really going to be what slows down your rig when you're putting things under load. It's all well and good to test something at 720p or 1080p with medium settings or high-end GPU and be like, yep, this processor is like 10% or 20% faster. That's fine. But in reality, you're not really going to notice that difference. You might in minimum frame rates with certain games. So once again, if you're into competitive titles with, you know, where minimum frame rates do matter and you're trying to drive a high refresh rate display, then there is certainly a better argument for keeping that processor the best you can possibly get. But for the average gamer who's perhaps on a budget, I think the 2700X, the 2600X even, are fantastic value for money. And also the 9600K is looking to be very interesting indeed. But once again, that's just my 2 cents with just thinking kind of like the larger audience here. With all of that said, hopefully you have enjoyed the video. Normal stuff, like, share, comment, and subscribe. I will be much more regular now with my uploads. Now I no longer feel like I'm kind of dying from jet lag. But take care of yourselves. Bye for now.